energetic, challenging. Thank you so much, Kristine. Inspiring, energetic, challenging. I think implicitly in a little bit of challenge there for British geographers in general, but also the RGS specifically. So we pick up that challenge. We've got lots of questions, so I won't delay further than to kick off straight away with Helen from Devon wants to know, how have you worked with both local communities and government to move forward together? How do you knit together that local community-oriented work while keeping local and national government stakeholders on side?
Okay, I'll try to do this very briefly because it's one of the most complicated questions someone could ask me. But if you look at the creation of protected areas where we work, Chile and Argentina, and this varies in every country, we work directly with national authorities, and in Chile with the presidency to declare new national parks and so on. And in Argentina, it's a process to go through Congress. When you're talking about rewilding, bringing back extirpated species, a lot of that work starts at a local level, goes to regional, and then sometimes, but not always, national as well. So, and also in rewilding, if like the jaguars, which we work with, and pumas in Chile, there's a lot of controversy or myth in many cases, or fear about predators being brought back into a system. So you work on that long before you bring the first individual in. You're working at that political level and social level as well.
Hey, I must admit, as you describe rewilding that includes reintroduction of jaguars and pumas, I think of some of our British reintroductions and efforts at rewilding, and I think that they're not terribly wild by comparison. But
no. I am a huge fan of rewilding Britain, and I know a fair amount about what's going on in Britain and throughout Europe, and you know, it's a challenge in Britain. Britain has been developed almost fully, so you're really restoring ecosystems and wildlife in areas that are probably the most challenging in the world in a certain regard. So I'm
indeed. Well, I'm sure your support is welcomed by those people that are working hard at this in the UK. And of course, we have an international audience for all of the RGS's lectures, and I'm sure we have tonight. Actually, that's been one of the benefits of COVID, is that we've really ramped up our digital production, and we'll just keep pushing at that. So another question, rewilding often involves the removal of livestock or arable land, productive land. How do you balance the conflict that generates between food security, the local economy, and conservation? Does that feel like a challenge, or do you feel that you've come out of the other end of some of that and have some answers that others need to know?
It's always a challenge. I come from we were raised on our great-grandfather's ranch in California. I am from a long-time ranching family, so I really understand this question very firsthand. It is always a conflict, not only of the facts, the economic facts and so on, but it's a conflict. Land use strikes to the heart of all human behavior, to our souls. So anytime, wherever it is, regardless of whether it's agricultural land or whatever it is, there is this inherent conflict between conservation and development. So you have that no matter what you're doing. We have worked in many cases where we purchased ranches that were for sale. And so in one very pretty famous case, we bought an estancia in southern Chile, which later became 764,000 acre Patagonia National Park. And when we bought that ranch, heretofore, we had never bought a ranch that with the livestock on, and for a lot of reasons, we didn't have that choice. So we bought the ranch, 220,000 acre ranch with 25,000 sheep on it, but it was lambing season. So within 6 weeks, we had 50,000 sheep or thereabouts. So every project is different. Not unlike the United States and many other countries, ranching very particularly is really collapsing. And southern Chile and in parts of northern Argentina and southern Argentina, that is also the case. So we've never bought any land that wasn't for sale. You can't force someone to sell to you. And so in every case where we've bought grazing lands, it's because the grazing lands have been denuded, and the ranching families, like my family, none of us wanted to be ranchers, and that happens in most ranching families. So the owner wants to sell, and we buy it. In some cases, because we want to work with locals on changing management systems and so on, sometimes we stay with some livestock, but generally speaking, the livestock comes off slowly because these are big territories and you don't want to upset the markets. And then it is the process of restoring, in this case, grasslands and forest. So it really varies. We have seen that a lot of ranchers in Chile and Argentina are picking up conservation as a product on their ranches. So instead of killing pumas or mountain lions, they're not killing them anymore, and they make more off of tourist dollars because everybody wants to come and photograph them. So we've had huge conflicts that we have come out of, but that's why conservation is not so straightforward. The change of land use is very complex emotionally and practically.
So there's a question that nicely steps off this, which is simply about how you get your projects funded. Now, I don't think it's a secret. It's a bit like the old joke about how do you make a small fortune owning a vineyard? Well, you start with a big one. And I think that it's worth saying that you've put a lot of your own money generated from your career in the garment industry into these initiatives. But you have also drawn in other supporters, haven't you? Have you got any tips and observations about gaining momentum behind philanthropy and other contributions to this kind of work? Obviously,
I'll be very transparent because this is a question I'm always asked. We were we had a business life before this life. My husband was the founder of the North Face and then Esprit Company, and I was before the ground floor of Patagonia Company and was the CEO for many years. Then we wanted to retire and work on the stuff that we're discussing today. In the course of that business career, especially Doug more than I, was able to accumulate what we think is a large personal collection of assets. And we decided to put those assets toward this work. So we have largely done that. In fact, almost all of it has been deployed over the last 28 years. So in the beginning, everything we were doing was financed by us. And I would say 2/3 of the way through, we were starting a big project, which we called mine. I'm not quite sure, but there's no way I had enough money to realize this huge project. So I thought, well, I'm going to set out looking for partnerships. And everybody said, oh, you won't raise any money. You're at Tompkins. You're known for using your own funds. Well, I have no choice. I have to do this. And so I went out and I did. And now I would say 85% of our work over the last 28 years was financed by our family foundation. But now that's turning, because as our foundation has deployed almost all of its funds, we're developing more partnerships to keep going forward, because now the teams on the ground and at every level, they have more experience than ever. They're very, very results driven, like we are, and we can still produce a lot of conservation work, but that's how that worked.
So to connect to this comment about having worked in the corporate world for much of your career and now invested literally your resources, but also your energies in what you laughingly call retirement, into a new project, yes, clearly not, into this extraordinary body of activity. What observations have you got looking at both of those worlds that you've inhabited around the moral imperative we have to stand up for nature? What kind of what observations do you have about the business of putting a price on nature? Can we put a monetary value on the benefits that nature provides? Where do you stand in this whole line of argument about putting a price on nature in order to protect it?
Well, it's not a line of thinking that we utilize nor agree with, but I understand why individuals and institutions make that argument, because they need it for fundraising, but it misaligns the human relationship to nature terribly. That said, you have to find ways to connect people to the natural world, because we only protect those things we love. We only protect those things, as I said, we know to be true, those things we depend upon. I believe that, generally speaking, the globalized economy is a system that does not see philanthropy as one of its engines. That is to say that there are goods and services coming in, and going out the other side, there is health and welfare for all. It just doesn't work that way. And I'm part of that. I understand it really well. So in the United States, you make a donation, you get a tax credit for it. So we raise a lot of money, we meaning Americans, raise a lot of philanthropic dollars, but there is a benefit to it. If you extracted that benefit out of there, I'm not quite sure what would happen to the concept of philanthropy, that the more you get, the more you give. And it's unimportant what that amount is, but that there is an understanding that every human being, either through muscle or coin, has to pay their rent for living on the planet. And that, so the people with the most money, which 98% of it comes out of the globalized economy, are in many ways and in many places the last to get connected up to this, as they say, your last shirt has no pocket. That during your lifetime, you have a responsibility not only to you and your immediate family and so on, but to the greater good. I'm not just rights, I'm also full of responsibilities. And so I talk a lot about this, and it, as you can see, it's a it's a big point for me, because we are losing so much so fast.
Yeah.
And the lack of dignified human communities around the world, and no water or poor water. I mean, the list is long, and I'm sure all the listeners know what this list is. So philanthropy is the ethos of sharing, and a sense of responsibility is severely lacking. And we all have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, what am I doing? By muscle or coin. It's got to be something.
Yes, I'm pleased to be reminded of what I thought was my exclusive to my own Canadian family, my great granny Grote's suggestion that there are no pockets in your shroud. And your point about, actually, it doesn't matter how you contribute. It might be through, as you put it, through muscle or coin. We all have a capability. So this links to a question where we're asked, what do you think is the single most beneficial action that we can take as individuals to build a wilder and more resilient planet?
Well, I think from the most basic nature is get out of bed and really make that statement true. I get asked a lot, well, what can I do? Well, if you're serious about the question, then get out there and find your own answers. Because in Britain, around the world, there are people working nonstop, whether it's on conservation of ecosystems, water systems for communities who are impoverished in that way. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, but you have to be the one looking for it. I can't tell people what they should be doing. What I can say is, if you're not doing anything every day, something, then there's a problem in how you see your life. And I'm no saint. I have to get out of bed just like everybody else. And when I look at these kids who for the last year and a half, 2 years, have been every Friday getting into the streets and bringing our culpability as adults to this question of how we live, and very specific to climate crisis, every Friday, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. It's the doing. Don't worry so much on the front end that it might not be the best thing or the most effective thing. It is the getting out there and the doing, and forcing yourself to be honest with yourself, saying, I want to change X. I want the red squirrel to come back. I want, wherever you are, there's work to be done. The back wetlands.
Now, when you say there's work to be done, when you say there's work to be done, I know you to be someone who loves to be in the wilderness, who has passionate love of nature. But you've described projects which sound like they had a lot of Sunday afternoon meetings attached to them. It sounds like you've really had to put in the hours to just moving it along with governments, with farmers, with just moving it along. Thousands and thousands of meetings must sit behind every extension of a protected area. Can you give us a bit of an insight into how you plan that strategically and deliver it at a mechanical level, but also actually just how you get up in the morning, gird yourself to go into what might on occasions be quite bad and annoying meetings to get to this end result?
Well, I think everybody gets up in the morning and has to, prepare themselves for whether it's getting the kids to school or whatever it is.
Kristine, we might have lost that first sentence with a bit of a buffer. So if you could, I'll start your reply again, please.
I would say that we all get out of bed every morning wondering what's going to happen to us and so on. So that's probably not special. I will say that we have had some very bloody problems in our early conservation work. A lot of death threats and all sorts of things. You know, this was a generation ago. So today I understand it. I think we've worked with 10 different presidents between Chile and Argentina over the last 28 years. We have worked with untold numbers of senators, mayors, town councils, and on some projects, some took 20 years. So the biggest challenge there is not to give up and to imagine that someday this 1 million acres that we have in pristine temperate rainforest will belong again to all Chilean people in the form of a national park. And no, we've had some rip-roaring fights with local ranchers in northern Argentina, and no, there's a lot of gunslinging.
David Carter from...
I mean, it happens, but we work in countries that are really tame by almost any comparison. So I just think you just have to keep your shoulder to the grindstone and don't stop. A lot of it's a slog.
Thank you. David Carter from Sidmouth in the UK raises a question that sits behind a couple of the others as well, about drawing boundaries, drawing borders around national parks. Could you just talk a bit about how you understand boundaries and borders, how they're marked out, how they're protected? Are they forever? Are they permeable? When and how should they be permeable?
No, they're not permeable. Just to answer that one point, in our case. So we fly every day. Flying our smaller planes and the larger planes have been what has allowed us to really understand landscape. And I'm sure a lot of people listening understand this. You're given your line of work. So flying was central to our ability to look at these areas that in many places are really isolated and therefore really misunderstood or not even paid attention to. Second thing is you're looking at what is the criteria? What is the ecosystem? Does it have to be restored? Yes or no? Is it pristine? Yes or no? What are the natural borders to an area? Who are the neighbors? What kind of neighbors are them? Is there federal land attached to it? Because one of the most important words for us in almost 30 years has been leverage. How do we buy 500,000 acres, but turn it into 1 million acres? And almost always the case is we see, and again, largely from the air and maps, we are map freaks, and that was really a benefit because so much of what we do is reading maps the way most people read the newspaper. And so we're looking at what is the nature of the neighboring lands. Is this area for sale? If buying portions of it, then you have to go, you get out of the plane, you go to the ground. We have unbelievable ground people, very few of them because they're very specific in what they do. And so the lines are drawn around projects. There's an assumption about an intact ecosystem, but then what were the boundaries of the original purchase? And then what's next door? Can you expand either through more acquisitions or making a deal with the government to include their land into this land that we're going to be donating back to them? So each project has its own particularities in how to answer that question, but those are some of the things that are pretty universal.
Mm. And my question around borders and bordering is partly informed by the knowledge that our next big academic conference at the Royal Geographical Society is on the theme of borders and bordering in the summer that's coming. And I'm certain that there'll be strands that address some of these themes. Mm-hmm. Within that context, I'm certain also, I'm slightly extemporizing from one or two of the questions, but I think this sits underneath one or two of them. The question of, in the UK context and the academic context, we would talk in terms of post-colonialism and decolonization, and the challenges there are within easy reach of the kinds of approach you've taken. Is it a form of recolonization, but in this case, albeit for benign purposes for nature? I think there's a very real challenge available there. And I'm aware that this has come up with other projects, for example, around forestry and carbon credits in the Amazon. What are your observations in response to that?
Well, we've definitely been called the new generation of European colonizers. But everything we have ever bought, of the 14.7 million acres that we've put into national parks, all of it has gone into the repatriation of those lands, the lands that were private that we bought, the repatriation of those lands to all Chileans or all Argentines. So, it is quite a bit different. People have asked us many, many times what our standing on, do we buy land with indigenous individuals living in it or anybody living in it? And we never have, and we wouldn't. So I know that there have been projects over the last 50 years where that was the case, and I personally, speaking for myself, I know there are cases where indigenous people have asked to be relocated for their children or whatever reason, but I would not be in favor of the concept of moving people off their lands. I don't know if that addresses the question.
Yes, no, it does pick it up. And Nigel Windsor in the wilds of Oxfordshire the Cotswolds has a question about the relationship between conservation and tourism. So are there points when people shouldn't be allowed in? Should tourists be excluded from fragile ecosystems for short or long periods of time?
I think so. I think we do something a little unusual when we're about to make a donation to a country to create a national park. We zone everything. We say this is an area, a fragile area, just to the question. These are areas where trails should be put in for people to transect the park. I heavily believe in zonification for protected areas. I don't believe that we should have access to every square inch of the earth.
And we've got a couple of questions about the next projects coming down the track. So one is specifically about what are the twinkles in your eye around further activity in Chile and Argentina? Are there projects you can tell us about that are on the drawing board or extend further what you've done already?
Oh yeah, no, what once the really large donations were finished, gosh, probably close to 18 months ago now. Before those took place, we already had what I sort of term as the second generation of our projects mapped and ready to go. So we're underway and have been for over 2 years on a new area of conservation, and really thinking about conservation in general. You can't make the world one giant national park. So what else, what are the other models for essentially doing something similar? And so that's one question. The second question is, only in the last few years did we go after marine conservation. And when we do, we're looking for marine parks, that is no take zones, not multiple use. Let other people do that, but for us, we want to go no take in the sea. And we were working with some other people. We were fortunate to finalize 2 very big marine no take areas in the Southern Atlantic. And so almost all of our projects now in the new generation that are underway have, we're trying to link the land, the coastal zone, and the sea together. So in some cases, going back and trying to get marine protection for these areas that were coastal, where we created the terrestrial side, and working down in southern Chile in the extreme south, marine and land conservation ideas and projects. In Argentina, still we're rewilding. We have rewilding projects always going on. But in terms of territory, we're looking at a lot more terrestrial conservation, but also this goal of really combining terrestrial, coastal, and not just 12 miles out in the sea. So that's pretty much a coastal zone. And then big rewilding projects in Chile and Argentina as well. Those somebody's always missing.
And can I invite you, we've got a couple of questions about whether you might expand into this activity into Europe, but you could express that instead as advice you've got for people who are ambitious to move this kind of approach forward in Europe. But also, I'm just interested to hear what your thoughts are on the US itself. Obviously, there's the national parks. I mean, the US has been very important in the development of the idea of national parks. And I wonder what the conversation feels like in the last fortnight and looking at the next 4 years around the wild and the quality of life in cities, and how you can connect up quality of everyday life for most of us in towns and cities with the quality of life that might be out there in an idea of a wilderness not far away. Just an invitation for you to make any observations about our ambitions for rewilding in Europe, but also some reflections on where the States might be in the next 4 years on this topic.
Well, I'll start off by saying that the UK is, I think, far advanced from the US. And if you compared the two, we were originally involved, sort of like the grandparents of a unbelievably interesting rewilding project, conservation project in Romania. Some of you may know about that. And of course, rewilding Britain. Oh, there's so many projects going on in Europe, and all it takes is, and it's probably taking place, the coordination, because countries in Europe tend to be small and heavily populated. So technically, it's probably a whole lot more difficult. But I have high hopes for Europe. I don't doubt for a minute that in 50 years, Europe has the potential of looking very different than it does today in terms of its biodiversity.
And I think some exciting things we're learning about some incredibly simple moves that can create wildlife corridors.
Yeah, it doesn't all have to be complicated.
Insects and plants, yeah.
Yeah. In the United States, you're hitting me at a very rough time. We think that we have a new president elect, but anyone listening knows what's going on here. I will say that I believe that President Trump has been the most dangerous leader of this country in terms of biodiversity, in terms of the potential of rolling back enormous areas of protection, whether it's in Alaska, it's all over the place. So we have had so much riding on this election, and terrible leadership. Putting COVID aside, just talking about conservation and territories at the moment, it's been a nightmare. And I think in this lapse between today and January 20th, there is a lot of talk of the edicts that he may sign that could be really seriously damaging in terms of regulations and the protection of areas that we have taken for granted for decades. So it's a fight. It's a fight we're all prepared for. And that's what's happening here. In terms of our own work, yes, I think about working outside of Chile and Argentina. And we do a lot of, it's informal, but working with people who are working on rewilding projects. If we can help somebody else do this, we're going to do it. Because for me, I just turned 70 in June. So my edict is I just want to see the maximum conservation, restoration, and rewilding done possible. I don't care if it's by us or by somebody else. And that's how we work. We want all conservationists and people working in this realm to have the maximum success that they possibly can. So, yeah, we in a way work outside of Chile and Argentina, but it's in a different way.
Kristine, you very nicely, I think, summarized both the motivations emotionally, but also the arguments and ways of being that have seen you achieve so much in your work. I think, among other things, you present a challenge to not all of us just as listeners, but also to us as an institution at the Royal Geographical Society to do our bit to move these stories on. So profound thanks, and
you're welcome.
Forward to you coming and appearing on our stage in the UK. So let's keep talking about your diary and how we make that happen. And we really have enjoyed having you with us. My very last task, after thanking you, Kristine, and saying how much we look forward to you joining us at the Society, is just to signal next week's lecture, which, Kristine, I hope you'll zone in on whatever time you're in, because it addresses another corner of the same set of questions that we're facing about the relationship between the sometimes too dynamic relationship between humans and nature in the form of climate change. And the title of the talk is Getting to Net Zero, What Can Nature Do? And Professor Gideon Henderson is going to look at the UK's climate change targets and explore how getting there will mean some big changes to agriculture and land use. So really nice set of connections between the two.
Good.
Professor Henderson would have been giving this lecture in the week that we all locked down, went home, and locked our front doors. So although it's still online, we're very glad to have him. And I think it'll be a really nice complement to this week's lecture. Thanks again, Kristine. And you have to now imagine a rousing applause for a lovely lecture, Beat. Okay.
Thank you, everybody. I'm delighted. Hope to talk to you again.
Very inspiring.